You can hear me?
Well,
Oh, yeah, good, good. Got it.
You still at the dental
hello.
clinic?
Yep, I feel like I should leave my mask on just in case.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for my husband who's having a dental implant. Theoretically, they'll call me. Whoops. Safari LTE, yes, that's good. Okay.
Are you on your phone?
I'm on my phone. Would it be helpful for people if I just didn't show my face? Does this look too bad?
No.
Like eating, like drinking and eating on.
No,
Whatever.
you're good. You're good.
Joanna, I'm not sure about your question. What is it you were seeing? And you're muted.
The text I'm reading has Roman numeral footnotes,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't see that Roman numeral within the text, or is it at the end of is it at the end?
They're real little.
Yeah, they should. Yes, they're the Roman numerals. I use numbered notes for like bibliographical stuff, and then the Roman numerals for comments. And so
Okay, so
there
maybe
are
I'm not seeing
little
the
tiny.
Roman numerals in the text.
Yeah, if it's there at the bottom of the page, it should be above it in the text somewhere. Let's see. There aren't a lot of them. Let's see.
There was one page I saw number 6 was in the text, but I didn't see the others.
Yeah, so like the first one, number 1 is on page 99 with an I. It's 1, 2,
I have it on,
5. It's 5 lines up from the bottom of the text I wrote, not counting the quote.
well, like go to page 8.
Uh-huh. So that one, where's that one? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 lines down from the top.
Oh boy, I really
Little
am
tiny,
not
it's a little tiny I.
yeah,
That's the
okay,
function.
okay.
Yeah, so they're just
I
tiny.
have to get new glasses.
Yeah.
Just do a bigger font. I mean,
Yeah.
just expand the whole thing.
There's always, yeah, with the PDF, you can always do that, let's see. One little bit of sad news I wanted to, unfortunately, need to share. Can I do this? There we go. Ellie
Oh no.
Weisenbach passed away
Oh, no.
Oh,
end of the year. Yeah, I was just shocked when I saw that news. It just doesn't seem like she's that old. Well, 39. She wasn't that old. Maybe older than
wow.
she looks.
Hmm.
Yeah, that was a shame.
Yeah.
Okay, for class purposes, you all know me, right? I'm looking at the faces wait, Nikki, I'm not seeing a face. Have you taken a class with me before?
Yes, I'm finishing my lunch, so I'm trying not to be seen.
That's okay. All right. I'm just wondering how much introduction I need to do. But I think you're all familiar with me. So we could just Oh, you're not. Wait, who's that?
Catherine Collins.
Okay. So Catherine. All right. Well then, okay. So
Can you switch back? Can you switch back from your screen?
There we
Oh,
go.
there. Okay.
So I did my master's in religious studies at the University of Colorado. Graduated in 1991, and I had the good fortune of sort of doing that at a time when the students of some of the great masters in the study of religion were professors. So almost all of the faculty members at the University of Colorado's Religious Studies Department did their PhDs at the University of Chicago. And because in the 60s and 70s, Mircea Eliade was there, and a guy named Jonathan Z. Smith, who is still alive, and I think emeritus now. But the two of them had kind of different methodological approaches to studying religion, and both became the biggest names in the study of religion, really in the world. So Eliade edited an encyclopedia, a multi-volume encyclopedia called the Encyclopedia of Religion, and Zepp edited a massive dictionary called the Dictionary of Religion. So they both sort of put their stamp officially on the field that way. So my master's degree anyway, so exposed to those people, and I focused on Jewish mysticism. I don't know how that happened. Just sort of stumbled into the mystics and found them fascinating. And then also liberation theology. So sort of the focus of my master's thesis. And then some time went by, and I went to Claremont Graduate University in Southern California, and did my PhD there in philosophy of religion and theology. And so at Claremont, I had the good fortune of studying with big names in the philosophy of religion, in particular a Welsh scholar named D.Z. Phillips, who passed away a few years ago, was probably the last great name in philosophy of religion in the world. So while I was there, what had occurred to me that was sort of sparking my interest was pinning down what religion's about. So when I started my master's degree, you should know I'm a lifelong atheist. I've never God ideas never made any sense to me. But I had religious grandparents, and spending time with them, I sort of saw that religion, they're Mormons, so it's really, socially cohesive, and they lived in Utah, so it's serious hardcore Mormon. So seeing that, growing up with that experience, sort of showed me something's going on with this religion thing. And I think that's why, as a young student, I sort of was curious about the subject matter. So at any rate, so by the time I'm doing the PhD, I've started thinking more and more, well, what is this religion about? As a master's student, I really was more hostile. It was more, what can we understand about religion, because we have to get rid of it. And but by the time I'm working on my PhD, what I've noticed is well, it's doing stuff in the world. Religion's doing stuff, and it has this persistence for some reason. And so that led me to spend more time on that question of what is going on. And I had done undergraduate work in psychology, so I always had some methodological curiosity about using psychology to understand human phenomena. So I wrote my dissertation then, trying to figure out what is religion, and that's where the book comes in. So it's my dissertation in an edited form, and it was meant to be the first half of a larger project that I've never quite gotten to the second half of. And when this probably was Joanna and Janet in particular asked if I would teach this class, it occurred to me there was an opportunity for me to spend more time with these old ideas of my own and have them more in mind, and that might help me kind of get the second half going. But we'll see. It has been interesting going back and rereading it, because I hadn't read it in quite a while. So it is, and it is kind of dense. I'm writing it for a group of professors who are going to be giving me a doctoral degree. So it's complicated. And what I'll do is just try to unpack it as we go along. My style with the teaching using Zoom is to try to bring in other voices. So I'll use some interviews in various forms. Try to avoid audio and look more for video to keep it visually interesting too. So I'll have some of the people that I'm relying on to explain myself in the book have videos from them or students of theirs, to try so that you can get a little bit of a sense of them, those people themselves, and how I'm using their ideas. Oh, let's see. Anybody have any questions yet at this point? I should mention, include before I really get going.
Just,
Okay.
I'll just simply put a question out in general that it depends on families and what their input was from various religious sources. And so your description is interesting to me because my grandfather was a professor of philosophy, son of a Methodist minister in Tennessee, mountaintop minister. So he went into philosophy and was very interested in psychology at the beginning of the 20th century and wrote about it. And it's just interesting how people were working their way through the whole process of religion. He didn't emphasize religion at all. And you know, when you deal with your families, they have different sources of religious input. And I suppose that's the experience of all of us. But anyhow, it's interesting.
Oh yeah, indeed, and that's where it all gets very complicated. Yeah, so what I'm trying to the project at hand here is really is generic. So I'm trying to explain what religion is in a way that you could pick any religion in the world, and the definition that I'm offering helps you understand why that's what that religion is and part of what it's up to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually, so it's sort of a grand objective in some ways to try and do that kind of definitional work. But that's the goal, is it has to fit something like we'll talk about like Aboriginal religion in Australia, has to fit high Catholicism in Europe, it has to fit, you know, Confucianism in China and Hinduism, and you know, so it has to, as a definition, it needs to speak to everything that we ordinarily would call religion in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the goal. It's in order to get there, right? What I'm doing is arguing that if we start with an understanding of what humans are like and how humans work, and we can take that up into kind of social relations like religion and see why certain sorts of cultural forms come along with human beings. And so one of those things is that it has seemed to the scholars who've studied religion all of these years that religion is a curiously universal thing, that any culture you find anytime in history, you seem to be able to pick out something that the scholars who study the history of religions would call religion. So that basic observation has long meant that people who study it are going to make it some sort of universal appeal, that there's something universal about human beings going on that explains this. Now, there is sort of one obvious direction to go in that, which is you'll see the direction that a number of the scholars go, and Eliade in particular went, which is, well, it's because God's talking to them. So if there's a God talking to all of humans, and the fact that humans then all have all religion, well, that would be why is that well, Eliade would like to use word more like the divine, as he has a much more abstract vision of God than sort of a personal God. But so the divine communicating with people, that's the universal. And so for Eliade, that's what makes sense, you know. And Eliade is kind of the generation of like Joseph Campbell, and so using Jungian ideas to kind of explain those commonalities, as Jung's idea of a collective unconscious. So I'm, as someone who's not convinced that particular answer makes intuitive sense, that suggests there should be another answer out there to explain that universality. And so that's why going to the construction of human minds, and so with what I start with Daniel Dennett, with selves, how it is we become a self. And here philosophy likes to use the word self-conscious, which you know, kind of in an ordinary colloquial sense, people will think, well, it means you're hyper aware of yourself, and that's a problem. But the philosophical term means that you're the sort of creature that is conscious in the sense of being alert and awake and wandering around the world doing things, but in a special sense, aware of that. And so conscious, self-conscious, that way, that you're aware of yourself as a creature that wanders around the world, and that other people are other creatures wandering around the world. So I want to start with that idea that there's something about how we go, how our psychological functioning is working, that religion must be responding to for religion to be universal this way. Now, I think this first bit, I think, is a bit challenging to how we think about things. And so really with chapter 1, what I want you to see is, we'll start with, is this first quote that I have from David Hume, which is where Daniel Dennett is starting from. So Hume lived in the 1700s. Scottish philosopher, very important and very, very forward thinking. But so just sort of try to think about what he's saying here. When I turn my reflection on myself, I never can perceive this self without some one or more perceptions, nor can I ever perceive anything but the perceptions. 'Tis the composition of these, therefore, which forms the self. So we think, you know, there's this one approach in philosophy is kind of essentialist, and that's not the approach I'm doing. But there's kind of one essentialist view would sort of leads us to a kind of intuition that says, well, the self of mine is a thing that I can contemplate, and so it exists and it interacts with the world. And what Hume's pointing out is that, well, if you really stop and think about what's going on and what you're experiencing, there isn't a self that you experience. There is the experiences of that self that you experience. So you have sensory data coming in, sights, sounds. You have your thoughts going on, words. You have the things you say in the world, and then there are these things you do. And what this view is arguing is that this self is not really a thing. It's the composition of all of those experiences added together. And so it's not it's a becoming, not a being. And that's the squirrely kind of philosophical thought, but I want you to try to wrap your mind around that. It's not being, it's becoming, because it's a process, not a thing. So we naturally kind of in our intuition move to things and thing talk and ourselves, that even the language is kind of thing language. But it's not a thing, the self that you have, that you are. It's a process that exists in time. And so to say what it is always an artificial construction, because you're trying to freeze it in one little moment to pick it out and identify it. But it's never frozen, it's always moving.
So that makes it malleable?
Yes, and so it's going to change, subject to lots of influences. So, I mean,
So
I'll come back.
do you always need to deal with it at a point in time then?
Well, yeah, see, that's where the language right? You get that, what is you is a constantly moving construction coming from experiences and behaviors. So I'm going to come back and run at this a second time. In between, I'm actually going to have Dennett cause even more disruption in your thinking. But Dennett has a couple of metaphors that he uses to explain this. Daniel Dennett's a contemporary philosopher of mind. He teaches at Tufts. Two metaphors he likes to use, both of them kind of to emphasize the dynamic. The one that's going to be most important is he calls it, and that yourself is a narrative web. Like a spider spins a web, you spin a web, but your web is thoughts and behaviors. As those manifest, that is you. And what I'm fundamentally arguing is that web has strands that are, some that are very important and thick and long lasting, and some that are fleeting. Most of what we do is fleeting, but then there's these stronger strands that come out of our basic experiences from childhood and their formation. What I'm arguing religion's giving us, that give us some strong strands, so that self is going to move and change, but it has anchors in a sense that those strong strands of the web are going to hold it down. Janet?
So to go back to this becoming, is that the same, or can that be analogous to the I'm looking for his name to get right, Alfred North Whitehead and all the little particles?
Well, that's also a philosophy of becoming.
Okay.
Yeah, so they have that.
Okay.
Yeah. There's kind of an old run at this idea that comes from Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, and he's reputedly said, you cannot step into the same river twice. Right?
Heavy.
So so the river also, it's constantly moving, constantly changing, constantly flowing. So you can't. He had a later follower said, you can't step into the same river once as you step into it. So
Yeah.
that's the idea. Yourself is like that, like a river. It's flowing.
Mhm.
Okay,
Okay.
Johanna?
Am I right, when I was reading through this, in thinking, if I were totally isolated, I mean, this is like a thought, I know this can't be real, but if there was no one around me ever, would I ever know my sense of self?
No.
Okay,
Actually,
that's how I understood it. That's how I understood it.
Yeah, there's a I think I quote Clifford Geertz, who's an anthropologist. At one point, if he says that a cultureless, which is kind of what you're describing, human being would not be an unfulfilled ape. It would be an unworkable monstrosity.
Oh,
But-
wow, yeah.
Because we are cultural creatures. If there's no culture, we wouldn't function. You would just, you wouldn't have human. You'd have something much more primitive than human, because you have to have culture to have the human. Okay, so first thing I want to do then is to be a little bit disruptive with a TED talk that Dennett gave, and the goal of this is to offer sort of some illustrations about how he thinks and where I'm coming from and going with this. But his primary objective is to show you that your intuitions about your own consciousness are not necessarily reliable. And so that's sort of as a scholarly point, that I think really hit me. That helped me really kind of frame this in a different way, that it's like that, okay, our intuitions are subject to some processes that we need to study, and those processes can be misleading, and so we can end up not quite really appreciating what's going on even in our own minds. So it's TED Talk, so it's kind of short, but it's him, I think, also at his best. So it's also fun to sort of share his thinking with the class. So let me find that one. Here we go.
I'm going to speak about a problem that I have, and that's that I'm a philosopher. When I go to a party and people ask me, what do I do? And I say I'm a professor, their eyes glaze over. When I go to an academic cocktail party, and there's all the professors around, they ask me what field I'm in, and I say philosophy, their eyes glaze over. When I go to a philosopher's party, and they ask me what I work on, and I say consciousness, their eyes don't glaze over. Their lips curl into a snarl. And I get hoots of derision and cackles and growls, because they think that's impossible. You can't explain consciousness. The very chutzpah of somebody thinking that you could explain consciousness is just out of the question. My late lamented friend Bob Nozick, fine philosopher, in one of his books, Philosophical Explanation, he's commenting on the ethos of philosophy, the way philosophers go about their business. And he says, philosophers love rational argument. And he says, it seems as if the ideal argument for most philosophers is you give your audience the premises, and then you give them the inferences and the conclusion. And if they don't accept the conclusion, they die. Their heads explode. The idea is to have an argument that is so powerful that it knocks out your opponents. But in fact, that doesn't change people's minds at all. It's very hard to change people's minds about something like consciousness. And I finally figured out the reason for that. The reason for that is that everybody's an expert on consciousness. We heard the other day that everybody's got a strong opinion about video games. They all have an idea for a video game, even if they're not experts. But they don't consider themselves experts in video games. They've just got strong opinions. I'm sure that people here who work on, say, climate change and global warming, or on the future of the internet, they encounter people who have very strong opinions about what's going to happen next. But they probably don't think of these opinions as expertise. They're just strongly held opinions. But with regard to consciousness, people seem to think, each of us seems to think, I am an expert. Simply by being conscious, I know all about this. And so you tell them your theory, they say, no, that's not the way consciousness is. No, you got it all wrong. And they say this with an amazing confidence. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to shake your confidence, because I know the feeling, I can feel it myself. I want to shake your confidence that you know your own innermost minds, that you are yourselves authoritative about your own consciousness. That's the order of the day here. Now, This nice picture shows a thought balloon or thought bubble, which is, I think everybody understands what that means. That's supposed to exhibit the stream of consciousness. This is my favorite picture of consciousness that's ever been done. It's a Saul Steinberg, of course. It was a New Yorker cover. And this fellow here is looking at the Braque painting. It's by Braque. That reminds him of the word Baroque, barrack, bark, poodle, Suzanne R. He's off to the races. There's a wonderful stream of consciousness here. And if you follow it along, you learn a lot about this man. What I particularly like about this picture too, is that Steinberg has rendered the guy in this sort of pointillist style, which reminds us, as Rod Brooks was saying yesterday, what we are, what each of us is, what you are, what I am, is approximately 100 trillion little cellular robots. That's what we're made of. No other ingredients at all. We're just made of cells, about 100 trillion of them. Not a single one of those cells is conscious. Not a single one of those cells knows who you are or cares. Somehow we have to explain how, when you put together teams, armies, battalions of hundreds of millions of little robotic unconscious cells, not so different really from a bacterium, each one of them, the result is this. I mean, just look at it. The content, there's color, there's ideas, there's memories, there's history. And somehow all that content of consciousness is accomplished by the busy activity of those hordes of neurons. How is that possible? Many people just think it isn't possible at all. They think, no, there can't be any sort of naturalistic explanation of consciousness. This is a lovely book by a friend of mine named Lee Siegel. He's a professor of religion, actually, at the University of Hawaii, and he's an expert magician and an expert on the street magic of India, which is what this book is about, net of magic. And there's a passage in it which I would love to share with you. It speaks so eloquently to the problem.
Washington State residents, if you have a utility meter like this on the side of your house, you could get paid to go solar for no money.
I'm writing a book on magic. I explain and I'm asked, real magic? By real magic, people mean miracles, thaumaturgical acts, and supernatural powers. No, I answer, conjuring tricks, not real magic. Real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that's not real. While the magic that's real, that can actually be done, is not real magic. Now, that's the way a lot of people.
Thank you.
Real consciousness is not a bag of tricks. If you can explain
We
this,
need to make an appointment.
not real, whatever.
Sorry, could people mute, please?
And since, as Marvin said, and as other people have said, consciousness is a bag of tricks. This means that a lot of people are just left completely dissatisfied and incredulous when I attempt to explain consciousness. So this is the problem. And so I have to sort of I have to do a little bit of the sort of work that a lot of you won't like, for the same reason that you don't like to see a magic trick explained to you. How many of you here, if some smart aleck starts telling you how a particular magic trick is done, you sort of want to block your ears. You say, no, I don't want to know. Don't take the thrill of it away. I'd rather be mystified. Don't tell me the answer. A lot of people feel that way about consciousness, I've discovered. And I'm sorry if I impose some clarity, some understanding on you. You better leave now if you don't want to know some of these tricks. But I'm not going to explain it all to you. I'm going to do what philosophers do. Here's how a philosopher explains the sawing the lady in half trick. You know the sawing the lady in half trick? The philosopher says, I'm going to explain to you how that's done. You see, the magician doesn't really saw the lady in half. He merely makes you think that he does. And you say, yeah, and how does he do that? He says, oh, that's not my department, I'm sorry. So now I'm going to illustrate how philosophers explain consciousness, but I'm going to try to also show you that consciousness isn't quite as marvelous. Your own consciousness isn't quite as wonderful as you may have thought it is. This is something, by the way, that Lee Siegel talks about in his book. He marvels at how he'll do a magic show, and afterwards people will swear they saw him do X, Y, and Z. He never did those things. He didn't even try to do those things. People's memories inflate what they think they saw. And the same is true of consciousness. Now let's see if this will work. All right, let's just watch this. Watch it carefully. I'm working with a young computer animator, documentarian named Nick Deemer, and this is a little demo that he's done for me. Part of a larger project some of you may be interested in. We're looking for a backer. It's a feature-length documentary on consciousness. Okay, now you all saw what changed, right? How many of you noticed that every one of those squares changed color? Every one. I'll just show you by running it again. Even when you know that they're all going to change color, it's very hard to notice. You have to really concentrate to pick up any of the changes at all. Now, this is an example, one of many, of a phenomenon that's now being studied quite a bit. It's one that I predicted in the last page or two of my book, 1991 book, Consciousness Explained, where I said, if you did experiments of this sort, you'd find that people were unable to pick up really large changes. I'll show you if there's time at the end, I'll show you a much more dramatic case. Now, how can it be that there's all those changes going on and that we're not aware of them? Well, earlier today, Jeff Hawkins mentioned the way your eye saccades, the way your eye moves around 3 or 4 times a second. He didn't mention the speed. Your eye is constantly in motion, moving around, looking at eyes, nose, elbows, looking at interesting things in the world. And where your eye isn't looking, you're remarkably impoverished in your vision. That's because the foveal part of your eye, which is the high resolution part, is only about the size of your thumbnail held at arm's length. That's the detailed part. All the rest of your vision, it doesn't seem that way, does it? It doesn't seem that way, but that's the way it is. You're getting in a lot less information than you think. Here's a completely different effect. This is a painting by Bellotto. It's in a museum in North Carolina. Bellotto was a student of Canaletto's, and I love paintings like that. The painting is actually about as big as it is right here. And I love Canaletto's because Canaletto has this fantastic detail, and you can get right up, and really just get right up and see all the details on the painting. And I started across the hall in North Carolina because I thought it was probably a Canaletto and would have all that detail. And I noticed that the bridge there's a lot of people. You can just barely see them walking across the bridge. And I thought as I got closer, I would be able to see all the detail on those people and see their clothes and so forth. And as I got closer and closer, I actually screamed. I yelled out because when I got close, I found the detail wasn't there at all. It was just little artfully placed blobs of paint. And as I walked towards the picture, I was expecting detail that wasn't there. The artist had very cleverly suggested people and clothes and wagons and all sorts of things. And my brain had taken the suggestion. You're familiar with a more recent technology, which is there. You can get a better view of the blobs. See, they're really, when you get close, they're really just blobs of paint. And you will have seen something like this. So this is the reverse effect.
I had just started as an engineer working on the International Space Station.
Do that to you one more time. Now, what does your brain do when it takes a suggestion? When an artful blob of paint or two by an artist suggests a person, say, does some of Marvin Minsky's little society of minds, do they send little painters out to fill in all the details in your brain somewhere? I don't think so. Not a chance. But then how on earth is it done? Well, Remember the philosopher's explanation of the lady? It's the same thing. The brain just makes you think that it's got the detail there. You think the detail's there, but it isn't there. The brain isn't actually putting the detail in your head at all. It's just making you expect the detail. Let's just do this experiment very quickly. Is the shape on the left the same as the shape on the right rotated? Yes. How many of you did it by rotating the one on the left in your mind's eye to see if it matched up with the one on the right? How many of you rotated the one on the right? Okay. How do you know that's what you did? There's in fact been a very interesting debate raging for over 20 years in cognitive science. Various experiments started by Roger Shepard, who measured the angular velocity of rotation of mental images. Yes, it's possible to do that, but the details of the process is still in significant controversy. And if you read that literature, one of the things that you really have to come to terms with is, even when you're the subject in the experiment, you don't know. You don't know how you do it. You just know that you have certain beliefs, and they come in a certain order at a certain time. And what explains the fact that that's what you think? Well, that's where you have to go backstage and ask the magician. This is a figure that I love, Bradley, Petrie, and Dumas. You may think that I've cheated, that I've put a little whiter than white boundary there. How many of you see that sort of boundary with the Necker cube floating in front of the circles? Can you see it? Well, you know, in effect, the boundary is really there in a certain sense. Your brain is actually computing that boundary, the boundary that goes right there, the boundary that's going right there. But now notice there's two ways of seeing the cube, right? It's a Necker cube. Everybody can see the two ways of seeing the cube? Okay. How can you see the four ways of seeing the cube? Because there's another way of seeing it. If you're seeing it as a cube floating in front of some circles, some black circles, there's another way of seeing it. As a cube on a black background is seen through a piece of Swiss cheese. Can you get it? How many of you can't get it? That'll help. Now you can get it. These are two very different phenomena. When you see it, the cube one way, behind the screen, those boundaries go away. But there's still a sort of filling in, as we can tell if we look at this. We don't have any trouble seeing the cube, but where does the color change? Does your brain have to send little painters in there, and the purple painters and the green painters fight over who's going to paint that bit behind the curtain? No, your brain just lets it go. Brain doesn't need to fill that in. Aha. When I first started talking about the Bradley, Petrie, Dumas example that you just saw, I'll go back to it. This one, I said that there was no filling in behind there, and I suppose that that was just a flat truth, always true. But Rob Van Leer has recently shown that it isn't. Now, if you think you see some pale yellow, I'll run this a few more times. Look in the gray areas, look in these gray areas, and see if you seem to see something sort of shadowy moving in there. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. There's nothing there. I'm just no trick of that. This is Ron Rensing's work, which was in some degree inspired by that suggestion of mine at the end of the book. Let me just pause this for a second if I can. This is change blindness. What you're going to see is two pictures, one of which is slightly different from the other. As you see here, the red roof and the gray roof. And in between them, there will be a mask, which is just a blank screen for about a quarter of a second. So you'll see the first picture, then a mask, then the second picture, then a mask. And this will just continue. And your job as the subject is to press the button when you see the change. So, show the original picture for 240 milliseconds. Blank. Show the next picture for 240 milliseconds. Blank. And keep going until the subject presses the button saying, I see the change. So now we're going to be subjects in the experiment. We're going to start easy. Some examples. No trouble there, huh? Can everybody see? All right. And indeed, Rensick subjects took only a little bit more than a second to press the button. You see that one? .9 seconds. How many don't see it still? What's on the roof of that barn? It's easy.
Okay.
Is it a bridge or a dock? There's a few more really dramatic ones, and then I'll close. I want you to see a few that are particularly striking. This one because it's so large. Yet it's pretty hard to see. You see it? See the shadows going back and forth? Pretty big. So 15.5 seconds is the median time for subjects in his experiment there. I love this one. I'll end with this one. Just because it's such an obvious and important thing. How many still don't see it? How many still don't see it? How many engines on the wing of that Boeing? Right in the middle of the picture. Okay. Thanks very much for your attention. What I wanted to show you is that scientists using their from the outside third-person methods can tell you things about your own consciousness that you would never dream of. And that in fact, you are not the authority on your own consciousness that you think you are. And we're really making a lot of progress on coming up with a theory of mind. Jeff Hawkins this morning was describing his attempt to get theory, and a good big theory, into the neuroscience. And he's right, this is a problem. Harvard Medical School once, I was at a talk, director of the lab said, in our lab, we have a saying, if you work on one neuron, that's neuroscience. If you work on two neurons, that's psychology. We have to have more theory, and it can come as much from the top down. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's Daniel Dennett. And I think that's useful, well, partly because you get a sense of him, but also that it's important to sort of start with that sense that I'm going to try to explain something to you that I know is not really intuitive. And there's a reason it's not intuitive. It's because your consciousness is really just a bag of tricks. And once you get a handle of what the tricks are, it's kind of fascinating, but you still can't see them even when you know they're there, the tricks. Anyway, okay. So what Dennett came up with so he has these two metaphors. Now, let me give you a run at the second one, and then I'll come back to the first one. So the second one, he refers to consciousness as a narrative center of gravity. And here we need something to illustrate a center of gravity. Okay. So, right, center of gravity, this is sort of the important bit here, is not a real thing. It's a mathematical abstraction that you use to study the behavior of objects, how they move. When I do this in class, I normally use a chair, but All right, let's try the stapler. It's a little bit also uneven. So the center of gravity for the object is going to be the point at which you balance it, and you know, a little bit one way or the other would tip it. So with an object that's uneven, the important point is that the center of gravity is not going to be just the center of the object. So it's not just the center of the stapler, because the stapler has this empty space. So the center of its gravity is actually going to be off center a little bit towards the back, which has more mass. And so that's the point at which it would balance, is that center of gravity. So that's what he wants. The first thing he wants you to notice, right, is center of gravity is an abstraction that we make to understand something. The center of gravity is not a thing. And in some cases, it's not even located in a spot that has any of the thing you're talking about. It's just this mathematical average. So what he's getting at with narrative center of gravity then is this idea that we narrate our lives in words and deeds, thoughts, behaviors, things we say. So words, by words he means inner words as well as outer words. And so then the idea is, well, if you just take the mathematical average of all of those, that's yourself. So a self is equally an abstraction because it's a center of gravity. It's just a center of narrative gravity as opposed to physical mass gravity. So the other analogy, right, is this what he calls narrative web of self. So they're just different analogies to try and explain the same idea. And I think different points, one or the other kind of is more helpful, but more often I'll refer to his narrative center of gravity. I mean, his narrative web of self, sorry. So here he wants you to think about the way a spider web is constructed. And the spider is generally going to be sitting in the center of it because it's monitoring any motion it can feel in the web. But the web goes out to various points. Now, for my purposes, I would call your attention to the fact that some of those webs are strong and anchoring, and other webs just refer inside the web to itself. But the difference is that the spider's web is, you know, sort of vaguely two-dimensional. It's not really two-dimensional because it has thickness, but it's vaguely kind of two-dimensional, right? Because it has those two dimensions you walk through when you get it on your face. But as a self, a narrative web of self it's like that, but three-dimensional, where the third dimension is really time. And so you have this web that you've spun of yourself, but it's moving as you go through time. And so other strands get strands of the web are constantly getting spun off as you're going through time. And so if you froze it and kind of looked backward at it, you'd see what looked like maybe the two dimension and with the center. But all of that is important to some degree. It's going to have relative importance relative to each other, but they're all contributing to the thing, to that which is yourself as you experience yourself. Now, does that make sense?
So by narrative, does he mean, in a sense, our self-talk?
He means both things that you're thinking, so that would be self-talk, as well as things you do and say.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, you know, so you're aware of all of them. So they're all webs, all strands of the web that get spun.
Oh, yeah, right. You said words both internally and externally. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is so fascinating.
It's an interesting model. Sure, and yeah, he convinced me when I read his book, the Consciousness Explained book. Yeah, so narrative web of self, narrative center of gravity, same thing he wants to get at, just different ways of trying to explain it. Okay, Janet?
So this narrative, are you gonna link it in some way to free will or no free will? I mean, if we're all just neurons, 100 million robots,
Mhm.
And our brain is just taking the suggestion and turning it into something else, is that the same?
Well,
The same basis as those who theorize that we have no free will?
well, yes, in that any serious scientific account of consciousness is going to look at neurological substrates and what's going on with that in the chemistry, and in all of that analysis there isn't room for something called free will.
Yeah, okay. And it is magic. I mean, anything else is magic.
Yeah. So that becomes one of the tricks, is that
Yeah.
if consciousness is doing, is it's saying you think you're in charge.
Yes. Or otherwise we couldn't function.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
All right,
Oh,
so I can put them together.
That's a good way of saying it, Janet, that we had to do this in order to function.
Well, I didn't make it up.
Well, you explained it.
You latched onto it well. Yeah, that's the point. So what I want you to get out of this is sort of, here's this model of how consciousness works. And now I'm going to bring into that model an understanding of how religion relates to consciousness. And so that's where I get the idea of, and actually just sort of brief aside, there's a radio show out of the Bay Area called Philosophy Talk that was started by two philosophy professors from Stanford, and one's retired and the other passed away, unfortunately, and other people have taken over the project, and it keeps going. But in its original days, they had Dan Dennett on to talk about consciousness. And one of my sisters-in-law, like, she lives in the Bay Area and heard like an ad for this coming up on the radio. And so she sends me an email knowing what I was doing. And she said, hey, you might be interested in this. So I sent them an email and I said, I would really love to ask Dennett about my theory. And they were really very charming about it. So the hosts arranged for me to be the very first caller to talk to them. And because I had just started teaching, they referred to me as professor, but referred to each other by their first names, which I thought was really, it's really generous to do with a young new scholar. But Dennett, as you may know, is famous for his atheism, and he's very strident about it. And he doesn't actually know anything about religion, but he's very convinced of his atheism. And so trying to get him to understand that I was using his theory to explain religion, but the theory didn't have anything to do with God, just sort of wouldn't go in his head. And so I tried asking him, and he just replied, but he didn't seem to understand the question. And one of the hosts came back 3 more times during the course of the show to try to get him to answer the question. What did he think of the theory, of my theory, using his theory? And it's just like, he's so hostile to religion that he couldn't imagine that I could do that with his theory. So anyway, so I have a curious relationship with Dennett as a result, but love the Philosophy Talk guys. Anyway, so we have this idea then from me adding to him, okay, if you have this web and it's doing stuff, some of the strands of the web have to be more important than others. And that's just sort of intuitively true from his model, because anything you did over and over again, which actually is part of what religion is doing with rituals, you're doing the same thing over and over again. anytime you're repeating something, you're spinning that web again. You have a new strand of the web that's like that other one. I mean, think about, when you say, a prayer over and over, a song, you hear a song over and over, that you keep reinforcing the strand of the web that relates to that. And so just sort of basically anything that you repeat is going to develop more and more thickness to it. Okay, so where I'm going with that then is that given this universality of religion and the way that it's relating to culture, so all of this material is cultural for him, and then you can keep in mind a basic definition that anthropology came up with. Religion is the depth dimension of culture. I forget who came up with that, but it's a very simple basic definition. So if it's sort of meaningful defining the culture to itself, that's probably religion. Anyway, so depth dimension. Nan, did you have a question? Oh, you're muted. No, you have to unmute.
Would you repeat that definition?
That religion is the depth dimension of culture. So whatever is deep and self-understanding in the culture, that's going to be the part that is functioning like religion. So it's not quite too much. It's not the full explanation, but it's a useful kind of shorthand to start with.
And who said that?
I forget who came
Oh,
up with that.
okay.
Something we say over and over again in the field. Okay, so the universality of religion. Take this idea from the anthropologists, religion's providing depth dimension. That material is the material that the brain is using to spin this web. Okay, then there's got to be something going on in this that's more to tell about this story. And so that's the project then of the book. What is that more to tell? And the first thing that becomes obvious to anyone who studies religion is that there are a few big names that you encounter over and over again as you study the field, and they are picking out different big ideas that they're claiming are foundational for what religion is. So just to say, if you ask them what is religion, they'll give you push back, and they'll say religion is X, religion is Y, religion is Z. Well, that X, Y, and Z, it turns out, are easily defined because they keep coming back over and over again. So there's one big school of thought that says, well, religion is about mystery and human emotions and our relationship to those things. That's where Eliade comes in. So religion is about mystery, and then fundamentally that's going to involve our emotional lives because we have to understand and relate to the mystery. Then there's another school of thought that has said, well, no, religion is about meaning. Religion tells people who they are, what's going on. So it's existential. And for my purposes, that's represented by a sociologist named Peter Berger, who we'll talk about. And then there's a third school of thought that has said, well, no, religion is what brings people together and provides social cohesion. And that's an even older idea that was articulated kind of most completely by Emil Durkheim, who's a founder of the whole field of sociology, a French scholar from the 1800s. So in the field, there are lots of people write about these ideas, but there is very definitely these three major emphases that come out. Religion is about mystery and emotion. Religion is about meaning and definition. Religion is about social cohesion. And so my move was to say, they are all correct. That the reason that religion is universal and what it's doing is it's doing those three things. Now, the universality then is the part that then calls for some psychological explanation. Why would human beings everywhere, anywhere in time, need cultural products that are doing those three things? And then, you know, sort of along the way, it's important to note that if you study the details of any given religion anywhere in the world, you do find those three things. So they are the scholars who have argued those things are essential to religion were all correct, except in arguing that the others weren't. So that they are all three, all arguably universal features of human consciousness, and they're clearly provided by culture in its depth dimension, and we call that religion. So religion, therefore, is those three things. And then I have my own, let's see, how do I phrase that in a definitional form? Where do I do that? I thought there's a spot where I just put all three of I'll put that all together, and now I can't find it.
Is it page 7 with the tripartite foundation?
Yeah, yep.
I took notes on that.
Okay. So, that's my, I should have highlighted it for myself. Anyway, but point is, that's what I end up with then. So religion is then the cultural activity of generating those three cultural products for consciousness to absorb them and use them. What then the bulk of the book then is going to be about explaining why that would be the case. What is it about how brains work that those specific three products are necessary? Okay, I'm running out of time, but I did want to show you a little bit with these three, a little bit from these three ideas. Oops, come here. No, that's too big. So yeah, found a little introduction to each of those three people. So here's he and I was taught to pronounce it Mircea Eliade. He will pronounce it a little differently.
Be talking about my favorite philosopher, one of them, and I think the most important philosopher for philosophy of religion. His name is Mircea Eliade. So a little bit of background about Eliade. He was born March 13th in 1907 and died April 22nd of 1986. He was born in Romania. He was raised Romanian Orthodox, and as a child, he was fascinated with the Christian faith he was brought up in. And he also took an interest in Romanian mythology, and he thought of it as a connection with his ancestors. And that continued throughout his life, his interest in Romanian mythology and the Romanian god Zalmoxis.
The ancient folk religion.
So the beginning of his ideas, he started down the course of a life of ideas very early on. Growing up, he aimed to find and record what he believed was the common source of all religious traditions. And eventually he moved away from a strict conservative Orthodox faith to more perennialism. He saw so many similarities in different religions and different mythologies that they all seemed to have a common source, even though people articulated these stories and these beliefs differently. They all seem to be trying to get at a common source, a common ultimate reality. So he was educated, college educated between 1925 and 1928, where he attended when he attended University of Bucharest and eventually earned his master's in philosophy. In late 1928, he traveled to Calcutta to study Sanskrit and Indian philosophy under his teacher, whose name I cannot pronounce. And then in 1930, he hit a bit of a road bump because he fell in love with his teacher's or his host's daughter, his host and teacher, his daughter, who was only 16 at the time, and he had a sexual relationship with her. So he's a grad student and she's 16. So that was obviously frowned upon. And as a result, Eliade was kicked out of his host's house after this. 3 years later, he did receive his PhD from the University of Calcutta with a dissertation on yoga, which was actually made available and published in, I believe, the 2000s. So you can go out and buy his dissertation. Then he went on to teach. He taught at the University of Bucharest. He taught philosophy and religion starting in 1933, and he eventually came to the University of Chicago in 1956, and he was appointed visiting professor at first and then professor and chairman of the History of Religions department until his retirement in 1983. So the methodology of Eliade is called phenomenology. A phenomenological examination of religion seeks to understand religion as a practitioner understands it, not as a scholar would understand it. That means phenomenology does not seek to examine the truth claims of a religion, but rather the experiential claims. So it's not about whether the God of the Bible is true or not. It's about how a Jew or a Christian experiences the God of the Bible in their own life through religious practice. That's what a phenomenology of religion seeks to examine. It's not asking, well, does the biblical God really exist? That's irrelevant to a phenomenological claim or a phenomenological approach, I should say. Phenomenology of religion.
By the way, this method of phenomenology is originally a German philosophical idea with a guy named Edmund Husserl, who would have been in the generation right before Eliade was trained at the university. So when he's at university, this was sort of all the rage. Phenomenology was all that, and he's just taking it out of philosophy and into the study of religion. Was his contribution.
Religion expands into the disciplines of history, religion, psychology, sociology, anthropology, philology, and more. So it's very extensive, and it's had a lot of impact on academia. So the major ideas of Eliade, and I have quoted here one of my professors who said every great philosopher has about one or two great ideas that they just repeat over and over again. So I would say this is certainly true for Eliade. He has a few major ideas that he repeats over and over again, and he certainly makes his point. And these ideas are so profound that he can repeat them over and over again, and it doesn't get boring. So his two great ideas. Number one is the sacred and the profane. For Eliade, reality is an interplay of two dimensions of existence, the sacred and the profane. The primordial man / religious man seeks to live in the sacred, while secular contemporary man consciously or unconsciously lives in the profane, or at least thinks he does. That'll be discussed later on, whether we can ever really get away from the sacred. Eliade seems to think that we can never really get away from the sacred. The sacred is immanent. Now, what is the sacred? This is important to say. The sacred is what is outside of, well, the sacred is what's outside of the profane, but maybe that doesn't give you much to go off of immediately. The sacred is a suspension of the ordinary world. It's a suspension of ordinary life. It doesn't necessarily mean miracles, It just means having an experience, having a religious experience that touches you deeply and is profound to you. And
Now,
and
here actually sort of on primordial, that this is, scholars don't tend to talk the way Eliade talks today, but the ideas are still there. So people who lived in the Stone Age seem to have religion that we today call magic, or a religion that's based in magical thinking. And that's true of any form of animism. So which is kind of basic to Stone Age religions. And animism is the idea that everything has a spirit. So there is a spirit in the mountain, there's a spirit in the fish, there's a spirit in the river, there are spirits free floating, some are benevolent, some are malicious. And your job then, to survive, is to figure out how to relate to all of them. And so you need to be in the good graces of these spirits. And so magical practices then arise as a way of cultivating the good graces of those spirits. But it's precisely because Stone Age understanding of the world is so tenuous that their understanding seems to be very much rooted in magical ideas. And so, that to Eliade would make sense to say something like, well, the primordial human is an inherently religious one because they're always living in the sacred. But that's because they're always living in a world that's magically infused. And then it's also important to notice, well, this sacred has two sides to it. So it can help me, it can hurt me. So it's not always good just because it's sacred. It can be really, really bad and be sacred, as well as being good.
And often impacts your life in such a way that you live differently. If you had that experience rather than not having that experience. So the idea of an epiphany, right? Something dawning upon you. And for this, it's an epiphany of how reality works for the religious person. It's an epiphany. It could be an epiphany of God's love. It could be an epiphany in the form of a theophany, an apparition of the divine. Right. So it's anything that really stops you in your tracks, takes you out of the ordinary, mundane life, and takes you into sort of the profound, right, the sublime, and that, of course, connects to his second most important idea, which is the hierophany. He defines a hierophany as a breakthrough of the sacred into the profane. And
he made this word up. He has this idea. I need to explain it. Oh, and in German philosophy, that's what you do. You need to explain something. You just make up a word.
Can manifest as a revelatory illumination, like nirvana in the Eastern tradition, or noesis in a Western esoteric tradition. So you think of the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, right? He has this moment of nirvana where he realizes the nature of things. In that moment, he is taken out of the profane and into the sacred, into really ultimate reality, right? Later Buddhist accounts will say, he realizes the reality of the Dharmakaya, the truth body of the Buddha, and the Dharmakaya is ultimate reality. He understands the nature of things. So in that moment where he's sitting under the Bodhi tree, he is no longer just a man in the ancient world of India, right? He is taken out of time and into the sacred. The sacred is the suspension of time. And same with noesis, right? In the Western tradition, we have philosophers like Plotinus, who is recorded to have achieved a sort of noetic enlightenment 4 times, as his biographer says. And in those moments, right, he's taken out of ordinary time. He's taken out of the ordinary world, and he is experiencing the sacred, right? Much like what I described with the Buddha. So a hierophany can be this illumination, but I don't want to just limit it to that because it's not limited to that. It can also manifest as a place or an object that carries significant and archetypal meaning. So sacred sites, right? Jerusalem, Delphi, the shrine at the Bodhi tree where Buddhists can go and they can see the temple that stands there where the Buddha reached enlightenment. The religious practitioner can go to these sites and experience the sacred for themselves. You can have a profound experience, right? And this is the core of what it means to be religious, according to Eliade.
And that is it's an interesting thing, just so in and of itself, right? So one person has a profound experience someplace, and that place or something associated with it, you know, it could be a big rock that happens to be there or a tree, and then in sharing the experience, other people around that the original person will adopt that attitude towards that tree or that rock, and so you get sacred spaces created because of people sharing their experiences. And I mean that just on the face of it, I think is just a curious and wonderful thing about human beings sharing ideas.
Richard, it almost comes to mind when I assume a car accident happened, and then there are lots of flowers or a statue placed where the person died. I find that interesting. It's
creating a sacred space. Yeah.
Right.
Somber sacred space.
It is to experience a hierophany and to be taken out of profane space and into sacred space, and then to realize that the sacred is eminent and it is all around us, and the profane is sort of ever fleeting and doesn't even really exist. So that is my introduction to Eliade.
Okay, that'll work for us. We're running out of time here. Let's see. Oh, Janet, you have something?
Well, so just quick question. It seems like we call places of worship sacred spaces. So it doesn't have to be the rock. It can be, now we have this building that we call our sacred space, and if you enter this building, you're here. So it's not even experiential in a way. It's the next step. It's a designation.
That because we become self-conscious of it and now can do it intentionally.
Yeah, it's the intention. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, just a few more minutes here. This is a little bit on Peter Berger, and the guy doing it is from Amsterdam, maybe, I think. Anyway, and he says his name Berger, but he's an American, so it's Peter Berger.
What I'd like to do is provide a brief summary of how I understand Berger's theory on the sacred canopy and universe of meaning. So Berger was very similar to Weber and the postmodernist Bauman in the sense he was interested in how religion helped individuals find meaning in a meaningless world. So it comes from the social action approach to religion. The Berger highlighted that religion provided three things. These were the universe of meaning, in which religion provides a universe of meaning, and it shapes our understanding of the world around them. So everything that we experience, the whole world we inhabit, we understand through the help of religion, providing explanations on life, death, existence, as well as things like poverty, evil, and injustice. The sacred canopy is like a protective shield, a protective blanket, which helps us to deal with uncertainties, meaningless.
This was actually the name of his most important book, but that's the basic idea that he's going to put forth is religion provides a sacred canopy under which everything gets defined.
Points or issues from everyday life, problems within a universe of meaning. When Berger came up with the idea of the sacred canopy, he wrote that in his thesis that human beings need to order their experience and do so by imposing subjectively constructed ordering ideas on reality. A meaningful order, or nomos, as he called it, is imposed upon the discrete experiences and meanings of individuals. Berger uses the term nomos, and nomos is made up of society's worldview. So essentially, again, the sacred canopy helps us to understand the world, deal with issues, and provides a meaning. Lastly, he also talks about the homeless mind. These are individuals who have lost their religious beliefs and values and are left homeless with no meaning or values to attach to their lives. Now, Berger does argue that without religion, life would be meaningless for many individuals, but he does recognize that the functions of religion have been lost in contemporary society. One good thing that, again, he's recognizing secularization. So,
okay, and yeah, it's that I am trying to kind of run with that idea from him too, that because religion's universal, the features of it must be around still, even in a secular culture, but it gets more complicated to figure out where they're coming from and what's defining them, because there's nothing organizing it. It's idiosyncratic to each individual in a secular culture, how they're going to combine those things to some degree. Let me have a little bit here about on Durkheim.
Durkheim's most beautiful book appeared in 1912, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Les Formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse. It is presented as a study about the most distant origins of religious beliefs and practices. Durkheim used anthropological or ethnographic material. He was, for example, very interested in field studies about a tribe in Australia, Australian Aboriginals, whose religion was supposed to be one of the oldest types to be found on the earth. Durkheim investigated those clan societies, and he tried to prove that this kind of totem...
No, that's actually worth pausing on. Just that's true. Because the Aboriginal culture in Australia is so old, so they think that people were migrating into Australia something like 50 or 60,000 years ago. So there's 50,000 years of Aboriginal culture in Australia. And when you and for him, when he's there early enough, you know, now it's even more disruptive than it was then. But if he figured out, if he gets there before there's too much pollution from the outside world into that culture, he can actually see what religion looked like, because of their technological evolution was very slow. They're still living materially a very similar culture to the way they were 50,000 years ago. So you're looking at human beings 50,000 years ago and how they behaved. So Australia presents this really amazing laboratory that way for looking at human culture and human religion.
Religion must have been one of the earliest primitive manifestations of religiosity in human societies. But that is not why this is still such an illuminating masterpiece. I think the book is especially relevant today because it touches on some other core questions in the sociology of religion. Let me begin with Durkheim's methodological principle that the sociologist should always take the words of the people he studies very seriously, even if they tell you about an experience that seems to be very irrational or even crazy at first sight. Do not doubt their honesty. The experience that they tell you about is a deep reality for them. So if you notice, for example, that somebody treats a seemingly very ordinary object with a strange kind of awe and reverence, try to understand what is going on there. Don't mock the Aboriginal who seems to be strangely impressed by what appears to be an ordinary stone on the ground. Don't react with a smile when a Catholic prays to a small wooden statue. Don't criticize a patriotic citizen who experiences genuine pain when he sees that his flag is burned. Try to understand them. Try to imagine what their world must be like for them. And then the first thing you may notice is that the stone, the statue, the flag are in their eyes no ordinary everyday objects. They are different. They are set apart. They are charged with a special energy. Durkheim says that for those people, there is a clear distinction between the profane and the sacred, between the mundane everyday world and the religious world, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. If you ask a religious person what it is that she or he experiences when they participate in a religious ritual or when they are confronted with an object that they believe to be sacred, then they, of course, have to search for words first, but then they will eventually come up with an answer that, you know, they can feel a kind of power, something that at the same time frightens them and also comforts them. It can be frightening at times because it's a power that forces them to do certain things and to refrain from other things. And if you do...
Okay, so we're about out of time. These ideas are all floating around at this time period, right? So late 1800s, early 1900s, and Eliade is just kind of a later participant in that late 1800s, early 1900s conversation. The most famous version comes from a German scholar of comparative religion named Rudolf Otto, who in trying to sort of describe the sacred, he coined a Latin phrase, mysterium tremendum et fascinans, so that the sacred is mysterious. There is a mystery there. It's tremendous in the original Latin meaning of that word, as in causing tremors. So it can be fearful and ominous. And et fascinans, it's fascinating to us as well. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. So that's the sacred. Our world doesn't have as much of the kind of the dark side, what Jung would call the shadow, in the way that we talk about religion most of the time. But historically, it's always been there, and that makes sense when you think about the Stone Age, right? And that all the magic that's coming out of animism, and half of it is going to be threatening, and half of it's going to be supportive of human life.
Well, isn't hell the dark side?
Well, that's a sort of a version. It's the Christian version of that kind of thinking, and that is one way it has persisted. Yeah. Now, right, and then the whole school of modern theology, especially liberal theology, doesn't even believe in their hell as a concept.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah,
but
so
I'm looking at it from the practitioner's point of view.
yeah, well, or at least conservative practitioner.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to a little after 1 here. Let's see, I got to stop sharing, don't I, so I can say goodbye. Well, thank you all very much. I think that worked pretty well.
Yeah, thank you.
Richard, should we read chapter 3 for next week?
So yes, so we're just going to skip over chapter 2 because that's really
too hard.
Stuff I had to write from it, just that normal people don't care about. Right, so we'll skip on to
3. Okay.
And that's going to be why would human brains need to have this mystery managed for us? What's going on that we do that? All right. Oh, and I am recording these classes, and so I'll send you out a link to that so that you can go back and watch it again if you wanted to refresh, or if you missed class, you can catch up with it. All right, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
See you next week.